I'm Steven Adair, president of Volexity. Despite titles, very hands-on on the things that we work, including this. It's something that was very near and dear to my heart for quite some time. So talk, as you can see, is titled The Nearest Neighbor Attack, How a Russian APT Weaponized Nearby Wi-Fi Networks for Covert Access. This is something that we worked on, one of our most challenging and most interesting engagements. The Volexity team worked on it very closely. Specifically, would like to thank Sean Kessel from my team and Tom Lancaster. But we had several other individuals that contributed and worked on this as well. So I'm not going to spend too long on about Volexity. I'll just kind of say, hey, if you're not familiar with us, information security firm, we kind of do services that, incident response, forensics, threat intel, and things that where our blogs, these engagements, what I'm going to talk about today, where it actually comes from, the hands-on type stuff, when our customers allow us to talk about it, which fortunately in this case, they did. This actually happened some time ago, so they just recently allowed us to do so more publicly. And then if you're familiar with like memory forensics, that's our space. Our team runs the Volatility project. We have kind of commercial products around acquiring system memory and analyzing it that we use in our engagements as well. So kind of like the services products is where we do a lot of this stuff, where you see a lot of this interesting activity and so on. One last final stop. I won't go through all of these, but if you're like, still, who the hell are these guys? I don't know what they are. Exchange Zero Day back in 2021, that was found by us during an engagement. We talked about that publicly. And I'll fast forward kind of like the last two, where we had the Avanti Connect Secure VPN that we caught being exploited at a customer last December, kind of publicized in January this year. And then the Palo Alto Global Protect Firewall Zero Day that we caught back in April. We work on a lot of interesting stuff. Some of it sees the light of day, others doesn't. But that's kind of like us in a nutshell. I am going to talk fast because I have a lot to cover. This is probably normally like an hour-long presentation, and I'm going to try and bust it into 28 more minutes. So introduction. So today's presentation, like I said earlier, is probably one of the more interesting things that we worked on. And for us, that's saying a lot because we work on a really cool things. It's a little bit different. The name of the title, or if you kind of seen some of the stuff that came out earlier today, gives away a little bit of where this is going, but I don't think that's to the detriment or any problem. The kind of the way we like to do these talks, the way I like to do them, we're walking through how we investigated it. So from where we started, how we looked at it, and where we ended up. This actually took place, I said, some time ago. It was actually, and it started off for us in February 2022, 2.5 years ago, but nothing about the talk is necessarily old in the sense of like, oh, that was old, I don't care about it. It's kind of like stuff we're able to talk about now, like I said, and I find it to be incredibly interesting and happy to be able to share it with you guys, and thankful that you guys are here to have what I'm sharing, I think. So it's a tale that has a few components. I don't think you need all of these for a great story, but we've got a zero day, we've got a skilled threat actor that's living off the land, and then we've got a really innovative way to gain access to a target, our customer's network. And then last but not least, kind of married in there and maybe somewhat germane to the story, but doesn't play a prominent role in the way we tell it. But cyber espionage that's kind of likely, almost certainly, geopolitical motivations tied to it. So for us, where does this story start? A lot of Volexity stories, a lot of engagements, they start with an alert. In this case, it was a custom signature, or technically, if you ever recognize this, it's not too widely deployed, we don't see it a lot at this point, but Carbon Black Defend, a query that we had to look for a certain type of activity, something we had custom written, it triggered in early February. And what triggered was kind of something kind of interesting. I don't know how well you can read that. But we had a bat file in the root of program data, SQL program data executing, and then we could immediately see from the little snippet, it was launching reg or reg.exe, to export or dump registry keys or hives. So this kind of like immediately triggered our suspicious button. It's not something we see too often unless it's bad, and we hadn't had like an alert like this trigger from that signature since deploying it. So we kind of start our investigation. Obviously, we have an EDR console to log into. That's where we start. But we similarly, kind of like I mentioned, we're big on acquiring system memory, doing forensics, getting disk artifacts, kind of leaving disk imaging to like a last resort because we can get a lot of stuff we want out of memory or selective file and live response data. But we start prepping that. And a lot of our customers we work real closely with, we can either get this deployed directly ourselves or quickly through them. So kind of a little, right here, I'll just give you a little bit of this story, but it'll become like kind of important at the end, at least in terms of where we go ultimately with attribution. But servtask.bat did a few interesting things. Not all it did, but what we could surmise from the EDR console, which is the limited visibility into like what was run in the system. But basically, it was running reg.exe to dump registry hives, the system security and SAM hives in particular. People do incident response or not. That's a bad thing usually to see on the system unless this is an authorized red team or purple team exercise, which, spoiler alert, this was not. And then it ran PowerShell to compress that data up and put it in a file called out.zip in the root of program data. So it's not necessarily, it's living off the land. I wouldn't say it's like necessarily the most subtle or sly thing you can do, but this wasn't actually triggering a lot of other alarms, and it was caught by a signature that we had, and we started digging into it. Some of the other abridged notes, and like I said here, we're putting in a lot of investigation into a really short presentation. So I'd love to spend a full hour on just this one incident and how that worked, but I don't have the time for that, unfortunately. But we dug in a bit more on the EDR console and said, hey, an unprivileged user that works as an organization logged into the server. A zip file showed up called defragmentserve.zip. Then suddenly there was an exe and a bat associated with that ran, and ultimately from the execution path is what ran that serve task.bat file that we detected on. So kind of putting some pieces together, a user had RDP in his system, GUI WinRAR was used to actually unzip this file. We had like little bits and pieces as we're looking. And we also came to one other thing which is kind of interesting that kind of like threw us for a loop a little bit. There was a file called Waze with a Z, WazeGoose 52.dll, and it was in this fake Adobe directory. So it was in program data Adobe, and then this like v.3.80, like a made up number. This isn't a real folder, shouldn't be there, it's clearly fake. But this kind of showed up on the system, was unsigned, and it said it's a shim from BestSec. So it's kind of a lead of odd things going on as we're working backwards. And kind of notably, the parent process for that showing up was the print spooler service, so spoolsv.exe, the Windows print spooler. So this is like, bits and pieces we're getting just from looking at the EDR console. But, and you look in the WazeGoose, there's nothing online about that, but we clearly know this is bad. It's part of the attacker activity. But it's like, we're just at the beginning here. So collecting memory. So in this place, we actually have a way over the network through RPC to push Surge, our memory collection utility. We actually start collecting memory back to a physical sensor that we have in this organization's office. But it's a large memory sample. I want to say it was like 128 or over 100 gigs. So it does take some time. It's it's a fast process. We have a good connection, but just collecting that much memory and the selective files that go with it take a while. Kind of our typical process where possible, unless we're dealing with like a breach in Microsoft 365 or something. We want system memory, and alongside that we get like the page files, and we grab other selective files like disk artifacts. So the registry hives, like our attackers had described, would be a standard thing we would grab, but we'd get like the MFT, we'd get things in the root of program data. We kind of give it like a glob list of files that we just get knowing nothing else about the system. Obviously that list can be edited to include directories like that Adobe directory you saw or other things, but kind of this standard set of stuff that we know. Without collecting a full disk, these things are the type of stuff that I know I'm going to want to look at the timeline or otherwise kind of figure out what happened on a system. Like temp directories and other things that bad guys might drop files into that I can just, without any knowledge, potentially grab on my first shot. So what could go wrong? Our memory collection utility kind of has a check-in where it says it kind of gets a status. It's been 30 seconds, still going, still going, still going. But then it reported a system status telling us that the system we were collecting from was being shut down, which is probably one of the things I don't want to happen in an IR engagement is to lose all the volatile data. So I think about it, I was like, hey, type of things I'd want to hear about more than this happening. Maybe my dog threw up on the carpet, my house is on fire, finding out my wife is my sister. I think I'd rather hear all of these things than have this happen. And I'm not exaggerating. For people who do IR, you could be with me here. You get one shot at this sometimes. So very disappointing. And all those other things haven't happened as far as I know. So this is the worst thing that's happened so far. And that's 2.5 years of activity. So despite that, we get the part, this was shut down, the customer shut it down. We said, hey, that's isolation was good, we didn't want it shut down. It's okay, you roll with the punches, you move along, you have to, that's IR. So we get a new collection, boot the system back up. We're still gonna grab memory, there'd be something persistent, there's no reason not to grab it. There's, we could have stuff in free space that's still useful, regardless of the reboot. And then we grab all those other artifacts that we mentioned. But despite losing that, which there may have been some extremely valuable stuff in that memory sample, especially in unallocated space at that point, none of the previously identified files were there. So we had some of those directories. We looked manually. We went through like the MFT, kind of like an FLS processing, like the MAC times. Nothing was there. Nothing we could recover deleted space. And we found that attackers were using utility that we had not run into before. And I can't say I've talked to all my dear friends and colleagues here to say how common is this, has other people seen this, but we had never seen the Cypher.exe utility, which is built in since Windows 2000 or so by Microsoft. It allows you to securely wipe files. So they went in and permanently erased like all the stuff behind themselves. And we could see this ultimately from the EDR log. So not only did we not get anything, we lost volatile memory. They had securely wiped it, so there's like no hope of even carving this out of the disk. And there was nothing in the page file for us to grab either related to this. So whatever those exact tools were doing besides dumping the registry hive and compressing that, we were kind of SOL. But not all is lost. There's still some interesting artifacts. We have the attacker was RDPing. We had a username that they used that we already knew about from the EDR events. And then we get an unknown IP address. So there's an IP, right? Okay, we know where they connected from. That's like a pretty good piece of evidence. That seems like it would lead to this being a very short presentation and we're all said and done. Unfortunately, you have IRs that are open and shut, and you have some that are less optimal in terms of the path or the speed by which they get resolved. This will be one of those ones where I'm going to hide a lot of frustration and long activity in a very short presentation, as noted. But we take that IP address, we look at the EDR, really nothing other than what we knew already. Any other log source didn't have anything. And then I mentioned we were collecting back to a device. We had network security monitoring, we had this network instrumented. So that's a big thing with Volexity, huge on network security telemetry alongside EDR and other data sources. Not a thing, we had nothing in there. So this system was essentially, from our perspective, a ghost. We didn't have internet beaconing, we didn't have lateral movement, we didn't have it connecting to other systems. It was just kind of like invisible to us. And we went to the customer and they're like, I don't know what that IP address is. And you would think like, hey, maybe we dig a little deeper, but it kind of hit a dead end. I think, once again, people do IR, sometimes things don't necessarily work as quickly or as fast or how you want them to. So we just have a period of time where we remediated everything we could. We gave advice. We had things we wanted to do, but we had a lull in activity and kind of really no meaningful progress until, unfortunately, a month and 2 days later, quite some time, I know, but a phantom returned. So our attacker came back. We had a new alert on March 6, 2022. And might add you, I think I mentioned, our attack started before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now it's continuing after. And attackers come in, and they're running VSS admin. They're doing volume shadow copies. This time, instead of just getting registry hives off of a random server, they have now pivoted and are managing to run this on a domain controller, which is, to even do that, it's already bad news, but significantly worse, right? The file ntds.dit, that's the Active Directory database. They grab one of the registry hives and other things that you would need to, say, crack passwords. And they've kind of gone for some crown jewels in here, and this is crown jewels of living off the land, right? They're not running Mimikatz, they're not doing process dumps. They're kind of, this stuff should get picked up. It's commonplace at this point that this happens in detection in terms of like, this isn't necessarily stealthy, but this is like living off the land to the max once again, what they're doing. So buckle up, here we go. We're just kind of like in the beginning of getting started once again. And our investigation continues. So obviously they've run this on a domain controller. So that's a key focus, right? That's something, getting an alert like this on a domain controller, it's not the most exciting thing. I mean, it's exciting, like you're excited, but it's bad news, right? So we go there and like I said, we get a couple hurdles. So let's look at the event logs from the domain controller. That should log all these, Active Directory, domain authentication events, regardless of the network, especially on itself, the domain controller. And we come to find, hey, 4624 events and 4625 events, success failures, they're not getting logged at all. In fact, they were getting logged like a year and a half earlier. So back in 2020, there were some logs. Not particularly useful to look at a log from a year and a half ago. So come to find out, they have like this whole mishmash of like conflicting GPOs. I don't believe this to be malicious or like disabled by the attacker. It's just like a crazy set of things that overwrote one another. And we see some commands were executed through scheduled tasks, likely through WMI or some other means running the system. But we kind of get a dead end there too, because a lot of the stuff we wanted to see, hey, here's the IP, the computer name, all this stuff, it's kind of not there because a lot of this logging has been disabled. So clear at that point, we work with the customer and say, hey, we need to fix this logging. I think that actually may have ended up working with Microsoft, but in the meantime, we said, hey, let's get some sysmon custom configs deployed so we have even more detailed logging and not have to worry about that GPO getting fixed and all this data. On all the domain controllers and some of the other select servers. It's kind of like an interim workaround. And that gets done. And then a few days later, we finally kind of catch a glimpse of the ghost. So March 10th, 2022, new activity occurs, triggers alert, we jump on it. This time we have an account, we have an IP address, we have actual stuff. We have like real data now that we can sink our teeth into. But we still have no visibility from our network sensor. And that IP address is basically like the same range that we had seen back in February. It's like the same subnet. So like, hey, we're like a dog with a bone this time. Like, I don't care. Like, if I have to relocate my family into your office, we're going to find out what this is together. But the customer is great. Like I said, they let us talk about this, very cooperative. But this time it was a priority. Found out that this is part of their enterprise Wi-Fi pool. So, the wireless network, the enterprise network that staff and employees use. And they're like, hey, one of our domain controllers, I think like one of the backups, it serves as a DHCP server for wireless. So we're like, oh, that's great. Let's go pull those DHCP logs, which are working and logging. But there's no record of any of these IPs being handed out going back to February, or even this activity from March 10th. It didn't show up in there at all. Kind of a dead end, but like Kool-Aid Man, we busted through, and we had kind of a good breakthrough. The customer, turns out, which I feel like we should have known this beforehand, but once we learned this a bit more, they had a wireless controller, like a Wi-Fi controller, where you can log in, and I don't want to say the brand, but like it's incredibly detailed. You log in, it tells you the access points, the signal strength, where they're installed. It's got like maps of each floor of their building, where each one of them is, the signal strength, users that have connected to it, how long they were connected, their MAC address, all this really great information, like super detailed, like a dream come true. Like this is the opposite of finding out that the system is being shut down in the middle of collecting memory. So it kind of made up for it a little bit. And the good news is when we look into that, we see the attacker's IP address in there. So like we're kind of tracking, and things are starting to work out for us. Not only the IP address is in there, now we have a username that's associated with that IP because they authenticated to the enterprise Wi-Fi, which uses Active Directory username and passwords. And we have a MAC address. So this is awesome stuff. This is beautiful. We're loving it. We do know they're actually on Wi-Fi, 100% confirmed, not just something using that range. And the next piece is that's really good. We say, hey, could this be like a rogue user? Maybe his machine's hacked. Can you reach out to them? And before we can even finish that thought, they're like, yeah, this user pretty much, they don't come into the office. They're like a remote user for the most part. They may have lived in the Washington, D.C. area, but they're like, no, they don't ever come in the office. And mind you, most of this activity was happening between like 1 and 4 a.m., be an odd time to be in the office to begin with. But they checked the badge logs for the building. User wasn't in there, contacted the user. It's like, nah, that wasn't me. So no surprise, but like we weren't expecting the user to be like, caught me, I'm a spy. But, since you just got to check, you never know. So that was out. But we had yet another solid case here. They had radius logs. So the radius logs also went back quite far. The radius logs where the authentication have the username, and they also have the MAC address recorded in it. So when we went and looked in the radius logs, we found the authentication events from the 10th. And then when we went backwards, we found the MAC address had also authenticated with the same username back on February 4th. And then when we searched that MAC address, we also found activity from late January that we didn't know about. The late January is actually associated with a different user account from the organization. And that user account had changed their password, either later in January or very early February. So they basically had an account that no longer worked anymore and then pivoted to another account to get on the Wi-Fi. So now we have one system by MAC address, 2 different accounts being used to associate to their Wi-Fi. We have a threat actor who's managed to move laterally, get privileged credentials, domain admin credentials, and is doing a whole bunch of other stuff, which we'll kind of talk about in a minute. But the good news is the puzzle's kind of coming together a little bit. But we're kind of saying, hey, like one of our, and like I said, this is a little bit of a serial way of describing the investigation, but lots of things are happening in parallel. There's people arguing in the company. People are like, ideas. It's a lively set of activity. It's not just happening one thing at a time. But say, hey, there's these compromised accounts. How could they have been compromised? Where are they getting these usernames from? We know they just went after the Active Directory database, but that's something that happened recently. This is January, February. Where are they getting these usernames from? So pretty quickly led us to a web server. And as I led it, we just kind of had a hunch. We know this organization pretty well, despite not knowing anything about their Wi-Fi, apparently. And we went and looked at that web server. That web server is actual web services. I don't want to say what it is. But you can authenticate against it. And at that point, you would get hit with multi-factor to actually access anything. But you can validate credentials against it. So you can conduct password spraying operations to validate credentials. But the bad guy would then at that point have to phish multi-factor or have some kind of bypass for it. But good way to validate domain credentials. When we went through the logs, we found the attackers had in fact since January and in February been doing password spraying. They'd cracked 3 accounts. 2 of them were the accounts we saw, and a third one that we hadn't seen them use. And none of those was actually the account that they used to log in to that initial server, so I don't actually know where that came from. But they had clearly managed to crack passwords, and we're turning that around and using that to get on to the Wi-Fi. So we're like, okay, that's pretty interesting. And then the IP addresses that were being used to brute force that activity were all like either ExpressVPN or PIA, I can't remember which one, but like not IPs that were useful for us to do any type of working background attribution, at least at like a surface level. So at this point, hey, we're connecting all the dots. This is what it feels like. Like I said, you're getting this in a very abridged version. This is like crazy war room type stuff. People are like, this is, we probably didn't put stuff, we probably did it more digitally than more putting stuff on a wall, but we're digging in, and it continues. So we go to the controller and we start digging back in. So I told you that controller is super detailed. It's got a lot of information. I'd never accessed it before until this day, but it's like, you're doing investigations, pretty intuitive, and then you have rocket science or training. So kind of start digging in. And it records, when you go look at the user and their authentication or IP, it tells you which access points they associated with. So you can see physically where like the devices they were connected to are in the building. And it turns out that in every single instance that we could go back, and I think we could map login activity to some degree. I think they have 180 or 90 days. So we had the stuff back to January, always connected to 3 access points. Those 3 access points were in a specific floor, in a specific room, on a far end of the building, in a conference room, by the windows, by the street. So we're like, oh, okay, this is kind of interesting. Like they're obviously not in the middle of the building. They're not moving throughout. They're not like on the left side and the right side. Every single one of these authentications, and I want to say it's like 5 or 6 different events at this point, where maybe they've connected and disconnected in the same day a few different times, always in the same spot. So kind of having an idea like, hey, we have almost like geolocating where this could be coming from, because it is on Wi-Fi. So we pay a visit. I drove out there, arranged with a customer, who, great customer, worked real well with them for many years. We went to that far end of that building, and we like didn't have a specific plan per se. I mean, I have a plan, but like, I don't know what I'm looking for. It's a conference room. They got like a smart TV, and like, is a smart TV? Like looking around, is there like a thing plugged into it? Nah, screw that. It's not the TV. You're looking under stuff. You're looking at the printers. Like we're checking IP addresses. We're just looking all around, and we come to this like server closet, and they're like, yeah, well, there's this like other internet provider that's in here that's not going through your network security monitoring, and it's like for this small support division of here, they're managed by this outside IT provider, and they have remote access into this. And I was like, oh my God, that's it. So we're like, yeah, and then we look, there's no Wi-Fi on it. We dig in a little deeper. That ended up being a dead end, but I was like super excited. I was like, oh, because I can tell you, like when you're really into this, we're even looking at like that initial incident, like, oh, this bad guy was active. Like they were, like I can see they were literally doing stuff at like 2:03 a.m. to 2:08 a.m. Went to like our flows and our packet captures. And I'm literally going packet by packet. It's like, is there like a Google Drive connection? Like we're like literally saying like, we can't figure this out, but maybe it's relaying through something. Is there something that doesn't stands out in the traffic? We find nothing. So we're like, oh, maybe this would make sense. Like they're egressing somewhere else. So there was an internet connection we didn't know about that really couldn't be used by any of these systems, but that ended up being a dead end. So we kind of said, hey, this device has to be dual home somehow. It has to be sitting here. It has to be something going on. But then we said, hey, could this be a close access operation? Could this be someone in the parking lot? I mean, it's literally by the window, by the street. Like, hey, do you think like it'd be possible to pull surveillance footage? I don't know if you have cameras even pointing there. And we didn't proceed, but that was like on the table, like legitimately, and I, half joking, half like serious. This is a precedent for that, obviously, a precedent for the threat actor that's doing this to do so. But how about that network visibility, right? We mentioned the Wi-Fi was a ghost to us. We couldn't see it. We had this other network. Customer was all over it. They jumped on. Their tech guy came into the office. He's like lives far away. He came in. They got us a feed of visibility of that other ISP. Probably not in what we know wasn't involved, and probably not super relevant. But like, hey, we want full visibility. Has access to limited like air gap machines. Well, not air gap, but like not with the rest of the network. And then they made it to the Wi-Fi access points. Basically, anything. If someone's connected to Wi-Fi and it did anything short of staying within that AP, we now saw it on our sensor. It didn't matter where it went. So by bad luck previously, wireless would connect to like that server. It would hit a segment where even with our internal lateral visibility, it wouldn't hit that and never got to our sensor. And it turns out the attackers weren't going out to the internet with it, so they were doing everything over that Wi-Fi connection. So we were blind to it, but no more. So now we can sit back and wait. And there's a certain level of remediation going on, right? There's these accounts we know that were compromised, we reset them. There's certain domain admin creds, but they haven't gone through a full-scale remediation. You could argue, yeah, maybe we could have done that or should have done it at any time. There's other reasons why these things don't always happen, as people here know, as quickly as you want. But in a way, we are now instrumented in a manner by which we are comfortable that if something happens, at least we will have more visibility. We don't know what that will tell us, but we'll start getting closer to it. So by the way, and why this is kind of relevant, what were they doing during this time? Some of this stuff we don't really know, but we do know that they were stealing documents and files and other work related to individuals explicitly working on projects or expertise related to Ukraine. So that was the sole and primary focus where we saw any exfil outside of things that were to maintain access, like credentials, registry hives, or other things. The actual data that was stolen strictly related to individuals, and those individuals either solely or primarily focused on Ukraine. So we saw this access ahead of the invasion, and we saw this continue like after, until this basically was shut down. But we said most of that exfil, we didn't see anything happen because we believe and are fairly certain they did that over the Wi-Fi connection. They would take that data out, like the earlier stuff we saw, and pull it through there. But we did end up catching a few instances where, before it cut off, they had staged the data basically in zip files, as we saw, with different file extensions that blend in. And they would put it in web directories that could be accessed over the internet, and they would download it. They would download it from IPs that, once again, were not particularly useful in terms of like attribution or mapping back infrastructure. But being an attacker is kind of very resourceful, living on the land, using mostly the Wi-Fi, but also a little bit of the web server, and is very familiar with their network. And basically, kind of said, hey, really living off the land, no web shells, which I have a bit of an affinity for web shells. Very disappointed that they did not deploy any in this. No backdoors, kind of nothing at all that we could find, and as far as we know, never did. But they returned, right? Okay, this is good news, what we've been waiting for. Good news, bad news. But they returned, and initially, because we're tracking now from radius logs and other things we're pulling, we're watching for MAC addresses and all kinds of other behaviors. We catch them coming back or trying to come back, and they were using the password, one of the passwords that had been changed. They got blocked, but they came back with a new credential. Presumably, I don't think we saw in password spraying, probably from the NTDS that did, or something else that they had obtained it from. But our visibility is fixed, so this is great news. And we're big on packet capture. We're network instrumented. We have it rolling. It's going. And even this case, they were on for a very short period of time. I don't think they actually did anything or really connected anything, but they came on the Wi-Fi. And we got something that was really, really, really big, which is the reason I can explain to you definitively what was happening today. So our biggest break was the packet capture. Their system was a Windows computer, and when it got on the network, it did NetBIOS name service query. So it said NBNS up. And basically, it advertised things, maybe it's MAC addresses, I can't remember, but more importantly, it shared its computer name, which wasn't particularly useful. It was, I think, like an asset tag type name, the characters. But then it advertised the domain, the Windows Active Directory domain it was attached to. And it turns out that Windows Active Directory domain was a name that led us to exactly where they were coming from. It was an organization that had an office immediately across the street, which we call Organization B, and hence now are named the nearest neighbor attack. So their nearest neighbor turns out to be, and we almost called it, I wanted to call it the naughty neighbor. Got overruled internally because people thought maybe people would envision something inappropriate. But in any event, the investigation expands. I know I'm running. I'm gonna go late. You can play the Oscars music if you want to kill me off here, but I got a bit more to go. So we ended up being able to connect with Org B through a trusted contact. And the evidence that we went there, this is very abridged. We convinced them basically, hey, I want to come in your network, bad stuff's going on, let me look at all your computers. And somehow, I guess I have a trustworthy face because I went there and I did just that. And I found out a bunch of stuff that we're going to cut through the chase on, but we found Org B was compromised in two ways. We found evidence that their VPN on their firewall had been accessed by the attacker, single factor, the credentials that worked on it. And their Wi-Fi was also being accessed by another organization, we'll say organization, or let's call them Org C. So we don't know the exact avenue by which they were, were they on VPN or another Wi-Fi when they kind of chained this kind of thing to attack our customer. But we did know that their Wi-Fi was also being, so these guys are daisy chaining, moving around, and they were kind of moving through the network until they found a computer with specific criteria. And we knew that computer's name from our PCAP, and we were able to, they didn't know exactly where it was, but we went to each machine, wasn't a lot of machines in our office at that time, and we found it. So it turns out the criteria they were looking for and managed to find, you could argue it's not called dual home, but it's a laptop plugged in to a docking station where its primary internet connection of how you would connect to it was now Ethernet. So it is a wired, had its connection and internet to connect to a wired, but obviously laptops have Wi-Fi adapters. So they use their credentials that they can move around this organization, found a laptop that's plugged into Ethernet, and then they were turning on the Wi-Fi adapter, using the credentials that they password sprayed against our customer, and then getting into our customer's network with that, and then moving laterally over that Wi-Fi connection from across the street. And they are likely thousands and thousands of miles away doing this. So it's like a close access operation where you're not actually close. You remove the risk of being physically arrested or caught, but you kind of have the same impact of being able to connect over a radio signal or on Wi-Fi. So I think it's kind of easy to understand, and I'll blast through these slides pretty quickly. But we say it started, how this whole attack started, right? It's someone, an attacker in Russia who had dreams big, right? They have these big dreams, and they're looking for a way to make a splash. And they say, hey, I want to target, and we don't know if like they targeted our customer first and worked backwards, or they hacked someone and then looked at their Wi-Fi. Obviously, we don't know that for sure, but this workflow is the same. They have a target in the United States that they want to go after, our customer, maybe more. They're in DC, thousands of miles away, and they find them, they say, hey, I want to break into that organization. But sadly, they have no way to get in. There's multi-factor, and they're like, I couldn't just phish their password or get them to install malware. I'm going to do something even easier. I'm going to look at offices nearby, and I'm going to hack into those places instead, the nearest neighbors. And they go in and they compromise both of those. We know they got into org B, and we know they got into org C. And then they start to look around in those networks looking for, they then go to internet-facing services. They crack passwords because they need a way to get into our dear customer, our organization A across the street. And they do that, they get those credentials, as we said, and then they move laterally through the organization to find a system that is dual homed with that Ethernet connection, but that they can use the Wi-Fi adapter and connect through. They move laterally, they find that system, and voila, they use those credentials to get in and hack our customer's network, which is our nearest neighbor attack. And that's what we've dubbed it. I think conceptually, yeah, it's like, what is it? How is that any different than someone's in Starbucks and like hack the Wi-Fi? 100% true, except for this is a nation state that did this from across the world and did it quite effectively and daisy chained multiple connections and ways to do so and was very, very effective at doing so. So attribution-wise, and I don't have too many more slides, we'll be wrapping pretty quick. On April 22nd, 2024, Microsoft released a blog about Forest Blizzard, and this is APT 28, Russian GRU, and they wrote this blog about Forest Blizzard using this toolkit that was at the time, which since patched, using a 0-day print spooler privilege escalation vulnerability. So it kind of sounds a little familiar, kind of interesting. So we read this with no specific, hey, it's out there, we're reading it, not like any, not even thinking. This is years later, and we read through it, and they have this toolkit that they're using, used exclusively by them, called Gooseegg. Gooseegg, I'm guessing the goose part of it comes from the file waysgoose that they find in there. You can't read it because it's so small, but if you read that blog, you will find that they had several components, including the registry hive dumping one-to-one match, outputting that into out.zip in the root of program data, defragment serve.exe, all the things that we saw. So when we saw that, we're like, oh crap, wow, that's awesome. Like we kind of assumed, like this blog says, we thought it was what we call CYBERWARCON, APT 29, because they had a previous interest and run-ins at this customer. And we knew it had to be Russia. Who else would go through this, the targeting? So we surmised Russia, but we're living off the land, really no way for us to map this back. But that blog and that specific toolkit, attributing it to APT 28 or Forest Blizzard, Sophisy, a lot of different names, that kind of sealed the deal to say, well, we already knew it was Russia, but now we know exactly which threat actor it is. Volexity's beautiful name for it, GruesomeLarch. And that was like a really cool thing for us. So I believe I am at almost the last slides. I know we have lunch. But kind of all this activity was followed by remediation efforts. Remediation can happen quite effectively where you do everything in one fell swoop. Sometimes it takes a little longer than ideal. Mass password resets, all these things done. It worked out pretty well, except for we had, in May, we had one final hurrah from our attacker. We got an alert that something was going on the network. Fortunately for our visibility, we were able to map it back through multiple machines that they were using NetSH to proxy through, almost like a Chinese APT technique that's kind of common at this point, like Bolt Typhoon was doing this. And we found they had actually, this time, broken into their guest network. The enterprise Wi-Fi had been remediated, but they had the guest Wi-Fi. They were using that org C to get in their guest Wi-Fi, and they found the one system on their network which was meant to be available to guests that unfortunately was on the corporate network on their actual domain, and they were able to connect through it. That was I just mentioned it because it's kind of interesting to see the persistence months later. But this was remediated extremely quickly. Our instrumentation was amazing at that point from the network system at every level. So this didn't last long. And since that, it's been, I guess, over 2 years. We haven't seen them since that we're aware of. So that was kind of the end of that. And then last but not least, we say, hey, how do you defend against this from the nearest neighbor attack? There's probably other ways, but obviously, at this point, kind of say to some degree, and maybe it's not really plausible or easy to do, but Wi-Fi essentially needs to be, and maybe you already took this model with your customers, networks, but those in the manner in which you want to lock down a firewall, a VPN endpoint, remote access into your network, like kind of Wi-Fi maybe needs to be thought about the same way. So if it's going to be out there and allowed and broadcast, cert-based auth, multi-factor, some kind of way that apparently, username and password, enterprise auths usually seem pretty good. We all know it's just a username and password. We can clearly see here that wasn't enough. Get rid of that. Our last case kind of underscored, I have a DMZ, I have a guest network. Usually it's the case. We had a rare instance where that wasn't and it was taken advantage of. Make sure your lesser trusted guest networks are actually that and they're fully restricted. And then the last two are kind of through obscurity, right? Dial down the DBIs, make the signal, don't name it. If the Wi-Fi network wasn't our customer's name, would the attacker gotten onto it? I don't know. That's an obscurity method, but kind of things to think about. And I know I've gone a bit over and we're running behind, but I am happy to talk to people. Email later on. I guess my email is not on there, but it's sadair@volexity.com. But feel free to email me, find me later. Glad to talk, but I appreciate everyone's attendance and listening to me talk for so long. Thank you very much.